Hello and welcome along to the RTÉ Rugby podcast. We are back with you to recap the big news around the BKT United Rugby Championship. Loads to get through today. Another big Interpro to look back on from last week. We've got transfer news, a big retirement from the URC as well, and some big games as well this weekend. To do all of that, delighted to be joined by Jonny Holland this week. Jonny, welcome. Thanks again.
No, thanks for having me once again.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. You do your column weekly on a Tuesday, but it is nice to have you on every now and again, and we can flesh out some of those details and call you up on a few things as well. But we'll get into that. We'll get straight into it. We'll start up in Belfast. Ulster 21, Munster 14. Really good, high octane Interpro in Belfast, and we'll focus on Munster or on Ulster to start with, because the nature of the comeback, and it was really interesting. A week on from them blowing a 17-point lead down in Connacht, you might have thought heads were going to drop a little bit, but to come back up and trail 14-3 against the defending champions showed an enormous amount of heart and guts to get themselves back into it. But as I said, like with your column yesterday on RTÉ.ie, just went into the details of how a lot of the times it's just nailing the simple stuff and getting the basics right. And if you look back on the way they brought themselves back into the game last Friday night, it was the simple stuff. It was, they got their set piece in order. They disrupted Munster's lineout. They started to win the battle on the ground at the breakdown, where Dave McCann was absolutely brilliant. And bit by bit, all of those basics added up. And it gets to the point where you get opportunities off the tee, you get opportunities to go into the corner and attack. And lo and behold, they come away. And by the time the full-time whistle goes, even though Munster had a chance to level it up and were probably a couple of inches away, you'd have to say Ulster were resounding and thoroughly deserved winners.
Yeah, I think they were deserved winners, but I think it was a disappointing enough game for me. I know there was a lot of action. Not the game itself, but maybe the attack structures. I just didn't think the game opened up massively, So when I was watching, I was like, we had a couple of tries early on, which kind of lures you into a false sense of it being a good game. And then it was a battle, to be fair. They did cancel each other out in some senses. The battle of that breakdown, I think, was the big story, and disrupting set piece. And Munster started well in the set piece, they finished poorly in the set piece, and probably the other way around for Ulster. But yeah, I just didn't think the game opened up massively, probably because they attacked the breakdown so much. And at one stage, I was looking at it going, the ball's in the ruck here for 5 or 6 seconds, and we know from the World Cup that all we're looking at the moment is breakdown speed and who's playing with the fastest ball, because they're going to do the most damage. And we've been looking at Leinster like that for quite a while, and Ireland as well. So when I was kind of watching the game, I don't normally watch a game and go, 2-second rucks and 4-second rucks, but it was just noticeable that the ball was slowing down. But that will tell you the approach definitely from Ulster, but from both teams. Obviously, your aim is to slow the other team down. But like you said there, I think we were expecting a big reaction from Ulster throwing away a lead in Connacht and getting back at home to right those wrongs in a sense. But it was delayed coming, wasn't it? They probably had a poor 40 minutes or so with the first 20 in this game, and then they kind of clawed their way back into it a small bit before kind of reaching their real pitch. By the end of maybe the third quarter in the Munster match, they really kind of had their dominance, So, but from Munster's perspective, it was so disappointing, going 14-3 up and then not scoring for an hour of rugby. Considering the last play of the game as well, where they backed themselves in the 22, they've got a really confident and coordinated 22-meter attack to not get over the line at the end. I think they'd be pretty disappointed with themselves. But there's so much within the game that you said there. The scrum was Munster 4 penalties in a row. Was it 4 penalties and an advantage, or 3 penalties and 1 scrum advantage?
I think it was 3 and 1.
Yeah, 3 and 1. So now you're talking about yellow card territory there as well. It didn't happen, but obviously Craig Casey scored on the 4th one on the advantage, and he got his second try. You think they're in the driving seat, especially with set piece dominance at that stage. They'll be very disappointed with themselves. And Graham Roundtree's interview was telling enough at the end.
Yeah, and to stay on Ulster, not taking away anything from Dan McFarland, because he was one of the first to actually say this as well, about how much praise he was putting on the players themselves for how they got themselves out of such a tricky situation. Because granted, it was 14-6 no, 14-8, sorry, 14-8 when the teams were coming in at half time. But as McFarland said, so much went wrong for them in those opening 15 minutes where they were coughing up penalties at the scrum. They were probably getting the wrong side of Frank Murphy at the breakdown as well, and they were giving Munster opportunities to attack. And as McFarland pointed out, by the time they even got in for the halftime talk where they were going to be addressing things, some of those things were already being corrected on the pitch by the players. They were starting to get back on side on in terms of the set piece. They were winning a couple of breakdown penalties as well themselves, and they were disrupting Munster's lineout. So a lot of credit has to go to the players in that situation for being able to problem solve on the pitch. And then obviously you give the coaches credit as well for being able to tweak other things at halftime. You can give them credit for the way they introduced the replacements in the second half that got players on nice and early. But an enormous amount of credit does have to go to the players out on the pitch for being able to figure out what was going wrong and also address the problems and get them right in the moment.
Yeah, I think like the credit goes to both, because the coaches obviously have that vehicle where players are confident enough to, or maybe they have the information that they find small cues on what's going wrong and how do we fix it. So there's a lot of understanding between both there, I think. But obviously, like, that's a dream situation as a coach where your players are starting to fix it for you and you don't need to go and rattle a few people to get those changes. Like, so going in a half time in those kind of games where you have felt already that the team are getting a handle on changing those things, I think you're then just reinforcing what they've done and why it's been good. So you're going in a half time with a very positive message, even though they were behind. But that's possibly why we saw them come on and come back out in the second half and kick on. And obviously they made their substitutions handy when you have an international or two to come on. And then Scott Wilson, was that his debut?
Yeah, I was going to mention him in a couple of minutes. Like, 21 years old. They were in a bit of a tight head crisis at the moment when you consider Marty Moore is still coming back from his ACL. It was good to see him, by the way. He was taking a part in the warm-up before the game. So you'd have to think he's probably not too far away from being able to get back out on the pitch, which was great. Tom O'Toole also injured at the moment. James French was out with concussion. So you've young Scotty Wilson, brought up, just 21 years of age, his Ulster debut in a big derby against Munster. And it was a pressure game as well, coming in off the back of that defeat. It wasn't maybe, the way we see a lot of these debuts in around some of the Christmas fixtures where an Ulster or a Munster or a Leinster or Connacht or whoever, they might have won their home fixture a few days beforehand, and for the next away game they might ring a few changes where the result necessarily isn't going to make or break a season. If Ulster lost at the weekend, they were probably in not so much in real trouble, but their season was in danger of kind of going off the rails a little bit. And yeah, I think as well, bringing him on when they did, it wasn't just bringing him on for the last 10-15 minutes. There was half an hour to go when he came on. Ulster were behind at that stage as well. And I'm sure who was on at that stage, it was either Jeremy Lockman or Josh Wycherley at loosehead for Munster. You're licking your lips at the prospect of a 21-year-old coming on for his debut in the final half an hour of a really, really tight interpro. But he was fantastic. Part of an Ulster scrum that picked up a couple of penalties, had an absolutely brilliant run at one point up the centre of the pitch, and just looked really, really polished.
Yeah, I think you wouldn't lick your lips at a fella that size coming onto the pitch, but I know you're dead right. But he's a big boy, and he definitely made a good account of himself. But what you're saying there in terms of the pressure being on, I think when the pressure is on a team, the pressure is nearly off someone like Scott Wilson coming on the pitch like that, because the outcome is going to be dependent on a lot more than him. Now it's a position where if you come on and make a couple of mistakes, if you have a couple of scrum penalties on top of what they've already had, then the line mate's on you, and that's a pressured situation. So I'm not trying to take away from it by any means, but he's coming on to a game where they're down. There was 3 scrum penalties in the opening quarter, soon to be a 4th one, but they didn't need it. So he's coming on being like, it can't really get much worse in my position. I'm going to have a crack off this, So like it's definitely kind of a liberating game for him to come on in, but he definitely made his mark on the game. He had that tip on pass from Ian Henderson, and he went he had a little line break where Archie thought the ball was out and gave away the penalty. So he had one big impact there, and obviously the scrum. What's going on in the scrum anyway, but like there's the loose side got up, but obviously he's holding his side of the scrum as well. and Nick Timoney was practically falling over the line for a handy enough try. I would say handy enough try. That's a very hard skill, controlling the ball and make sure you don't mess it up. But I think he did really well. But to go back to just before half time, I think it's possibly small but dramatic in terms of like, oh, the players fixed it and they had to learn so much on the spot, because they actually had, I think was it 2 scoring opportunities each, really, like maybe more than that, but like they scored a penalty that was possibly a try. It was a sin bin for Shane Daly, Ethan McElroy kind of falling / being hit going over the line. So like a couple of steps left or right from Jack Crowley, and that's a penalty try. So that's another score. And then they scored a proper try from a lot of good attacking kicks, which the conversion was missed on. So like their return in terms of points didn't really reflect what they actually had in terms of attack. Could easily have been 14-all going in a halftime. So they weren't that bad, but like they did kind of have a run against them where the opening quarter they couldn't touch it, and then after that they did get themselves back into the game to tee up the third quarter. Obviously made some good substitutions and then had a rattle off it. But Munster, like if Munster got over at the end of the day, it's 21-all, and we're not really talking about Ulster's dominance or Munster's lack of dominance. I think they'd have been disappointed in the performance, but it wouldn't been in the limelight as much, like, if you know what I mean.
But is that not part of it? Like where you're saying if Munster get over and score, we're not talking about this brilliant Ulster win. But isn't that the point in a way as well, where last season and the season before they had a habit of really falling away late on in games, and there is a lot to be said for actually holding out and doing it, holding a player up like Josh Wycherley over the line, Rob Herring coming up with that massive turnover to seal the win. Like it is those small moments at the end of the day that can completely change a team's mindset.
It is, to be fair. Like, you do have to give them the credit for holding on and kind of being. They were just really competitive at the breakdown. Like, I think the breakdown was so hard to call. There was so many illegal actions, and there was some called, there was some weren't called. But it's a really hard thing to referee at the moment. Like, Stuart McCluskey must be a pain to referee. You could see Frank Murphy and himself having a conversation at one stage, and Frank pinged him. And he's kind of going, "What's wrong with you?" Like, So it was a very funny one. David McCann as well. Ruck was formed, and he kind of poached over the top of it. Obviously illegal, but they were. I kind of find the one funny where people are counter rucking square and then they shift around and they kind of do get around the side. That's the one that's frustrating me at the moment, because there was 1 or 2 of those.
Ireland get away with that a lot.
They do, yeah. Caelan Doris gets away with a bit. I think I've said it on this podcast before. He's ferocious in the breakdown, but he does, like Leinster do that. The Leinster players in the Ireland team, I suppose is what I'm saying, do it where they hit square-ish, or they might hit on the outside shoulder and crab around it to a degree.
And kind of swivel their backside around.
Yeah. And then it's the same as the Dan Cole's one in the Ireland game where he got away with it as well. It was, I think, a different infringement where he engaged like that, swung around, and then put a boot on the ball. You're obviously not allowed to kick the ball, but you're allowed to hook it back. So they're trying to get their heel over the ball and disrupt it coming backwards. I just don't think it's a very positive action in the breakdown, but obviously you have to allow a contest, and if it's legal, it's legal. But so they're allowed to do it. But like the one where they're crabbing around, it's definitely a hard one to referee, because they are engaging square or square-ish, and then they're deciding to blur the lines in terms of what their actual entry is like.
One more point on Ulster. Well, no, sorry, a couple actually. One on the coaching. And I probably took away a little bit of credit for what they were doing in game. What I will mention though is the reaction from Dan McFarland and the Ulster coaches in between the Connacht defeat and the win against Munster. And I'd be curious to get your thoughts on it as a coach now as well, where I was at the sports ground last week as well for their loss to Connacht, and I did walk out of there that night a little bit struck by how well Dan McFarland took it, but how relaxed he was after that Connacht defeat, where I've seen him in the past. I've seen him lots of times after similar defeats like that, and he hasn't been pleased, where he's been very, very critical of his own team. And I walked out of the sports ground that night thinking that he was a man, and I wrote it as well, that he was a man that had actually taken a lot of positives out of that Connacht game, regardless of the score. And I had that thought with me all week going along to the game in Belfast on Friday night. And you can probably see the fruits of it in the way they reacted against Munster, where heads never dropped at any point. Players looked really, really motivated regardless of what stage it was. And there's a lot to be said for just the picking out picking out the moments and probably picking the right time to give the lads a kick up the backside or to give them a pat on the back and pick out the positives.
It's very early in the year, and like I think as a coach, you do have to try and have a bit more of an even keel. You're looking at an overall picture. Like players can be really frustrated with one or two moments, but as a coach, you're trying not to be that because it's an overall picture, like, isn't it? And if you get too frustrated in one or two moments, which we've all done as coaches at various levels, obviously, but like, you know, you do have to try and be bigger than that. And when you go up by 17 points away from home, like you're going to have to take positives from that. Obviously, you'll then look at what are the easy fixes and why did they come back at us? Like there's some easy fixes within that. We're not terrible, you know. So like similar to the weekend, I think the stats showed that they had 9 clean line breaks versus Munster's 1. So if Munster had gotten over the line, they'd be looking back at what happened in the game a lot happier than what Munster would have been. Because you're saying to give them credit, you should give them credit. They won the meters gained on the gain line and the tackle line. I think it was like 370 meters versus 200 and odd to Munster. They won the penalty count, they won the clean line breaks. So regardless of the result, as a coach, I think you have to look into what's actually happening. How many opportunities did you create? Munster's line break was probably Rory Scannell's one, if the stats line up, where Gavin Coombs popped the ball off to him in the last play of the game, roughly, wasn't it? So it took them that long to break Ulster, even though the score was 21-14 and could have ended up 21-all. But you have to look back at what you're actually doing in game. And that's where a coach is trying to separate themselves from, you know, a scoreline, what the media might be saying about you and how you're playing. You're the only ones really within that bubble that know how you're really playing. Did you execute the things you set out to execute, etc.? Like, you know, so in fairness, you know, that, like you said, it will have a knock-on effect into his team. Maybe there's no frustration creeping in because of how he managed himself and how he managed a group going into it. Maybe that's the week you show the positives and you get them back against Munster. Another week you might fly off the handle a small bit more because you think you should convert better, or you think you've been there before, you've had these conversations already, and you need to go with more of a stick than a carrot, you know. So I think it's definitely you know, and with experience in coaching, I don't have as much as him, so he can tell me what he was doing, but you know, with experience, you try to separate yourselves from one or two things as well, and have a bit more of an even keel.
Last point on Ulster. I just felt I had to mention David McCann's performance. He's a player who has been quite good for the first 3 rounds of the URC, and I think against Munster just brought it up 3 or 4 more notches. An absolute, just like a complete performance from a back row player.
It was really good. I think he was an absolute pain in the breakdown. He was a pain in Scott Buckley's side when he came on in the line out. He turned over a couple there. He was really effective, and I think on the commentary they were talking about his tackle stats, weren't they? How high they were for 3 games, and it wasn't even full 3 games, but Ireland should produce more back row, shouldn't they? We don't have enough of them. It's
yeah, I did see someone making a joke that after that performance, now Dave McCann has put himself right up into the top 50 Irish back rows, and like it's a complete joke. He's obviously he's right up there in terms of, like, you know, knocking on the door for international selection. But that was just that was the joke. But there is just, I mean, anytime, like it must be a nightmare being one of those younger back rows who are a little bit out on the fringes, where you've got players like Josh van der Fleer, Peter O'Mahony, Caelan Doris, Jack Conan ahead of you, and you're kind of thinking there, like, I mean, what more do I have to do? Scott Penny is another example, another try at the weekend. Has been captaining Leinster, or has captained Leinster for 3 of their four games this season. Like, there's just the depth and level of talent that there is at back row across 6, 7, and 8 is just mind blowing at the moment.
It's great. So even if you look at Nick Timoney that he's playing alongside, and Gavin Coombs, and then all of a sudden Brian Gleeson's coming into that, Alex Candellan's already been in that. Like, you're talking about high level back rows. I know Alex didn't probably have his best game at the weekend, but you're talking about a lot of high level back rows, and they can't really see the pathway at the moment. Scott Penny is probably the greatest example of that. Like, what more can he do in a Leinster jersey? He's competing directly with those players as well. He gets shoved out most European games for the Irish back row, and it must be really frustrating. But David McCann's timing coming into another couple of rounds of URC into European games, if he can have big European games, all of a sudden your Six Nations squad's been selected, like, you know. So I think his timing is impeccable at a time where it's not that anyone's looking for major change, but if there's someone popping their head up, you know, it's the time to make that change, and all of a sudden you're in a Six Nations squad. And like we've seen in the last cycle of World Cups, which is just I can't really talk about a cycle of a World Cup at the moment. But if you look at, the selection is consistent, and whoever's in a system gets back into a system, and the later that goes within the 4 years, there's no one new coming in. So like getting in at the start of that would be no harm at all for someone like David McCann.
Yeah. To move it on to Munster, like you kind of mentioned earlier on, we were talking about Dan McFarland picking out the positives from the game against Connacht and how it was probably a little bit more carrot than stick between those two fixtures. Going off what Graham Rowntree was saying after the game on Friday night, both on TV and when we were speaking to him afterwards, I get the feeling there's going to be a lot more stick than carrot down in Limerick used this week.
I think so. I think he's probably right, and like the reasoning why that's different is because you're ahead in the set piece, you're ahead away from home, and you just leave them back into the game. Like I think that's the really frustrating thing. Whereas Ulster might have solved some problems, Munster let them. They were in control of the game. When you're in control of the game and the set piece, you're wondering as a coach, how have we let that one go? How have we not scored for 60 minutes? How do we not create an opportunity within 60 minutes to get over the line? And I think sometimes as well, like I said, when you've given them enough detail, clarity, opportunities, and you kind of just play out a bit of a stalemate. Maybe letting opposite numbers get the better of you as well at times. Like maybe some of those things will be heavily frustrating. Like so there's obviously something within Graham Rountree's mind that he doesn't like whatever battle they went into. But I think, like I said in my column, you're talking about the basics of the game: scrum, line out, and breakdown. They didn't sort their own breakdown. I know. Mike Prendergast is big on breakdown and ruck speed and how that affects your attacking structures. That's probably something that's really going to that causes all that self-reflection, doesn't it? And you're going into the week being like, what have we done? How do I fix this within another week before we play the Stormers and go back at home? Whereas Ulster were going up at home to try and get redemption from the Connacht game. Munster are going to Thomond Park, where there's a lot of expectation, and there's a Stormers team coming that don't particularly like them, I'd imagine. So there's a lot on the line for Munster to turn around this week. Obviously, there are small changes. I don't think there's going to be mass change during the week, but like there is a small bit of pressure on that one now.
Yeah, it's just like it, and it was funny. Like we asked Rowntree, like what were the areas Ulster got on top of you, and he basically just listed out every area there is in the game, like set piece, at the breakdown, in defense and attack, yada yada yada. But like you mentioned, the Stormers coming up this week, and Munster are in a spot now where like there's a run of tough games in a row. Like you had Ulster, Stormers this weekend, Leinster next week, Glasgow the week after, then you're into Champions Cup, and then you're into the Christmas Interpros as well. So right up to January, it's pretty much one tough game after another. So they don't really have the opportunity to take the foot off the pedal at all. But one of the things that came up yesterday when we were doing our Munster media call with Dennis Leamy was coming back round to what the South African teams have brought to the URC. And isn't it great that we're here where we've got a Munster and Stormers game coming up this weekend, and we're talking about how like there's a nice little bit of a rivalry developing between these two sides, where Munster have actually beaten the Stormers the 3 times they've played, beat them in South Africa twice last year. It's a repeat of the final. And granted, the Stormers aren't going to have their Springbok World Cup players. They've still got a very, very competitive squad down in Limerick. And it feels like as the competition as a whole, we'll get to Edinburgh and Connacht shortly, where a couple of years ago that might have felt like a bit of a dud game on paper, but it was an absolute cracker on Saturday night. And week on week, Munster and Stormers as an example this week, it feels like there are at least 1 or 2 games on that fixtures list every week that look like they mean something big, and that they are going to be good occasions and good matches, which is just good for the league as a whole.
I think it is good for the league as a whole, but like, unfortunately, I think Glasgow are great side. Edinburgh getting a win over Connacht like that, they're a good side, and Ben Healy is another conversation. But you're adding a lot of interest to the Scottish teams there as well. The Welsh teams are probably where some of this can fall short at times. At the moment, it's not really great for Welsh regions, but you're right. Like adding the South African sides, I think it's been genius. Like whatever we thought about it, I don't know if I was ever that negative about it. I think it's been brilliant, because at the time I think we were talking about it being better for Ireland's outlook on how to play against South African sides. I think it's added a different dynamic to the whole league, because they do play a different physical game. But actually, when you have that whole narrative around South Africans physical rugby, if you watch their club teams, they play a ferocious brand of rugby. Like they throw the ball around, they have some spark in attack. You saw that in the Munster Sharks game in Europe last year, wasn't it? When there was breaking away and scoring tries on transition. Like, so they've added a serious amount to the league. And then when you look through the fixtures, there's always something that's going to catch your eye in the week. Like, so it's you're right. And the Stormers going to Thomond Park. Yeah, they won't have their. Well, I'm not sure. I don't think they have their South African contingent today, but they'd still have.
They don't have their World Cup winners, but like they still have South African internationals there, like Joseph Dweba, Evan Roos. Like there's quality players in there.
Yeah, there are quality players, and they've always quality backs that are, like I said, exciting. But they're probably the next crop of South African players. When you look at the next World Cup, there'll be a lot of people within those squads that will be making the jump up, or at least expected to. So they're either internationals with caps gone back, or they're going to be the next crop of them coming through. So I think that'll be a huge one in Thomond Park on Saturday night.
There's two bits of Munster news that have come up in the last week. Firstly, a player that looks like at the very least he's coming in anyway is going to be Oli Jager from the Crusaders, someone that Munster have tried to sign a few times. We've asked Munster coaches about it in the last few days, and they've said so little about it and been so evasive about it. It's almost as if they've been saying, yes, we are signing him. And it does seem like it's going to be happening sooner rather than later. And it's an immediate move rather than something in the summer. Your own thoughts, what you've seen of him, what Munster need? Do you think is it a piece that fits the jigsaw nicely? Not the final piece in the jigsaw, but I might say, but just like it's a piece that fits in nicely.
Yeah, it fits in very nicely because, Stephen Archer, I don't know how many, is he in his last year? I'm not sure what his story is.
Not officially, but I think it's kind of reading between he's all going to plan. He's probably going to break Munster's appearance record against Leinster next week if he does play this weekend and next week. So it's very likely, I'd say, that it's probably going to be his last season.
I'm not sure what his contract situation was. I think that's the last year in his contract. But
yeah.
And then, we've had one or two projects around Munster's tight head situation, and I don't think you're winning a Heineken Cup with that, So, like, I think from their perspective, I think it is definitely an important piece in the jigsaw, and at a very good time. Obviously, he's been left out of the Crusaders squad, yeah, I think his age profile. Obviously, there's conversation around why he's not playing with the All Blacks. So Scott Robertson going in there. He's been his coach. He's got 7 Super Rugby titles, has he? 6 or 7, or he's been involved in a good few of those anyway. So there's conversation around why has he not stepped up in terms of his All Blacks credentials. But I don't think anyone in Munster is going to care about that. He's seasoned at this stage. He's got a lot of winning mentality. He's going to bring a different view on the game. I think a lot of things add up in terms of him going to Irish rugby in general, but Munster, with our Munster hats on, I'm sure it's after seeing the scrum at the weekend, it couldn't be better timing for that news to break, really. But I think we're still reading in between the lines. I thought I saw a quote from John Ryan saying he will add a lot, and I was like, oh, I hope he's got caught in the media to say something like that, or else he knows something from being down under. But it was kind of a telltale sign that he's coming to Munster. I'm not sure how that actually went away from a quote, but yeah, I think it'd be a great signing for Munster. I think they could definitely do with it as well.
Yeah, it's not a silver bullet for success, but it's something to keep them building and just add that bit of depth. And the other bit obviously was the unfortunate news for Andrew Conway having to retire, just 32 years old. And I think we had all thought after missing out on, I think it was about 14, 16 months with that knee injury, that he came back in the opening game, scored a try, and everything was great again, and he was going to be pushing to get back into the Ireland squad. But unfortunately, that knee injury just recurred, and it was so sad, really, to see him have to retire early last week, and came out of the blue, as I said, even though he was someone that had been out for a long time. And I know you've been in that situation yourself, having to retire before you would have wanted to, but a tough blow for Munster and Irish rugby, but also just for a quality player and someone who, having had minor enough dealings with him through the media and stuff, always seemed like just a pretty good fella.
He's a great guy, and I think, like you said there, it caught me off guard as well. I texted him saying it caught me off guard because I knew it was kind of I didn't know in depth about his situation, but he's obviously out for quite a while. He kept mentioning this knee injury, and then he came back, and then he was back out with a knee injury. So obviously there's red flags there. He's obviously giving something a go, and it hasn't worked out, which is quite a similar situation to me in terms of, like, people might be looking on me like, but he only played a game a couple of weeks back or whenever it was. But sometimes the injury is just not. I don't know what his story is now, but sometimes you have an injury there where you can do certain bits and pieces, or you can play a game, but you're not going to be able to train all week, play a game, and go back to back to back, and have the the ability to do that through, like you said, 3 tough games coming up, then Europe, then you're into the Interpros at Christmas time, and for him, he'd be looking to get into the Six Nations squad again. So I'm not sure what the details are of the situation, but obviously it's not his knee is not in a place where he can play professional rugby anymore, it's devastating. Like, he's in the peak of his powers. I know he's 32. People think that you're falling off the other side of a cliff at that stage. He's in the peak of his confidence, his professionalism, his preparation. And Andrew Conway is a guy that came down from Leinster, and I would have known about him at schools level. I didn't realize he was my year because he was so good. He was always a year or two ahead of me,
Right.
in terms of his development, at least. And there was so he's always on my radar, and then he was this Leinster superstar. So he came down to Munster, and I was thinking, D4 fella, an opinion of himself, and he couldn't have been a nicer guy. So I think it was a complete poor judgment on my part, at least. But I was kind of going, this is an unbelievable player to come down to Munster. And I remember being taken aback by him under a bench press, lifting 140 kilos in the preseason testing, and I was like, how has a fella like that just lifted 140 kilos like it was nothing, and it kind of gave me a bit of a more realistic, a bit of a reality check, maybe, that guys are strong. Fellas like him, he might look like a jinky winger, he will push you away, he'll beat you in contact. But I think it was his attitude. Like, superstar coming in from Leinster is very easy to get a chip on your shoulder. System went against you, but he actually just put his shoulder to the wheel, reinvented himself. Then he got kind of passed out by Sweets, Darren Sweetenham, and he had to reinvent.
Yeah, like it took him a couple of years to fully settle in as a key member of the team.
Yeah, but that's why I'm so impressed by him. Like, I remember having conversations with him. This was when podcasts weren't they weren't an everyday thing, and he was talking about the Tim Ferriss podcast and different bits and pieces he picks up from it. And I remember starting to listen to that because of him. He was all into like self-improvement, and that was a big thing that I noticed first. And while I was injured, then I would have had conversations with him around some stuff like that. But like I said, it was how he kept reinventing himself, how he kept working harder when he got setbacks. And Sweets beat him into the Irish squad. Sweets came back and didn't get back into the Munster squad because Andrew Conway had such a good reaction, So like, and then if you look at his stats, like 50 tries and 150 Munster appearances, 15 tries and 30 Irish appearances, that's some strike rate. Like, he's an absolute poacher. But it's because he does his work. He knows what's coming up. He can see the situations. His preparation was unbelievable. So like, it's devastating. Like I said, when I texted him, I actually said something along the lines of, absolutely caught me off guard, and my respect for him before he came was huge, but my respect for him when I got to know him was even higher. Like, he's such a good guy. It's poor news for Munster because of losing Earlsey as well in the same season, and it's happening all of a sudden. But it's just terrible news for him. I'm sorry to see it happen.
Yeah, and very best luck to him with whatever he has coming up ahead of him after rugby. Moving on to Connacht, beaten 25-22 by Edinburgh away, a Ben Healy drop goal with the last play of the game. It's a game, Johnny. I'm struggling to get a read on what this is for Connacht, whether it's a decent bonus point picked up away from home, or is it a bad defeat? Because on one hand, you look at it and you say, okay, they never led in the game. They were pretty much chasing. I know they were level a couple of times, but essentially they were kind of chasing it the whole way through, and they managed to get a losing bonus point out of it away from home. Whereas maybe a year or two ago, they could have lost that game by 30 or 40 points. Then on the flip side, you look back and think that Edinburgh had to do so much to just win by 3 points against Connacht. And you look at the last Edinburgh try that was allowed, where the Connacht players just switched off. It was a penalty under the post with 15 minutes to go. Edinburgh were narrowly ahead at the time, and they just left. They assumed Edinburgh were going to take a shot at goal. Defenders started walking in towards the post, left a massive overlap outside, and Ben Velicott took a quick tap, swung it out to Mark Bennett on the wing, and they score a try. And you look back at that and you just go, oh God, in a way it feels like they blew it. How are you squaring this result from a Connacht point of view?
Oh, I think, like, when you set out your year on paper, you'd be kind of looking at, sometimes I don't do this a lot, but like, I know people I've dealt with in the past are very good at it, kind of going, I think you'll pick up your 4 there. You definitely look for at least a losing bonus point here. I think you can have a crack off that one. And I think when you do that, you're thinking Edinburgh away is going to be tough, but like, for Connacht, a lot of levelers in it. They play on a 4G synthetic pitch, so do Connacht. You're kind of used to that. You shouldn't be getting caught off guard with a bounce of a ball, or a quickness of the game, or tackling not being up to scratch, because that's what you get on a synthetic pitch. People don't want to go to deck as much as you think they might. so you don't put your shoulder into the tackle as much. Maybe you're hoping someone goes to deck. But like I think, when you actually look at the game and what they've done, there's a lot of coach killers in there in terms of like Pete Wilkins in the media afterwards. I only heard a snippet of it. But if you're thinking about someone who's going to have a go off a player or two, maybe you're talking about someone like that away from home, putting yourself in a decent position, and then switching off like that, like assuming they're going to go at the post. I know what happens, but like it doesn't happen to you. Do you know what I mean? Like you don't want it to happen to you because it's they haven't worked for it. A bit of quick thought, fair enough, but like they haven't worked enough to get that try. You've stopped them, given away a penalty. They'll take three, and you'll back yourself on a quick pitch like that to get another opportunity to go ahead. Like so I think that's going to be a really frustrating one. And then to get the try through Cian Prendergast was a 22-all, and put yourself back in a situation where, as a team, you go right. We've scored, momentum's with us. Get back, get the kick off, either get out of your half or have a run off it. And they dropped the restart at 77 minutes, and then they managed to hold them up in the maul at 79 minutes. You can have one more crack off it if you want to, and unfortunately, the pass to JJ was along the ground, so he had to rush and exit. Only kicked it to the 22, which none of his fault, which gave them one more entry to get that score. Like they had a penalty advantage if Ben Healy didn't even kick it. So like, in one sense, they're lucky to get away with the bonus point. But I think a lot of things within their control that they'd be really frustrated about.
Yeah, and you said there, like, people who've been great at mapping out games down the line of what you think you should be getting. The fact that they won their first three games at home gave them a little bit of wiggle room results-wise for the three away games they had coming up. They've picked up one bonus point from the Edinburgh game, and now they're heading to South Africa. Good news is they got Finlay Beelan back. Bad news is they lost Jack Ainger. Bundy Aki and Mac Hansen have stayed at home as well to nurse some injuries. So they're in South Africa with minus a couple of key players. Two big games against the Sharks this week and the Bulls next weekend. And what is a decent return in your opinion from these next two games, Connacht wise? What's the minimum?
I think if you're Connacht, you're looking for 5 points, because I think they're on offer.
5 points across the two games.
Yeah, so like I think you either beat the Sharks with a bonus point. You don't really say that very, very likely because Sharks aren't going very well, but like they're going home. So I don't think that's going to be as easy as what I've just said. But like if you can get a win there and a bonus point in the next game, as in a high scoring game with 4 tries, or if you can get close enough to it that you put in a performance and get a losing bonus point. I like, obviously when you're in the situation you don't want to give up any game, but I think if you're the coach stepping back from this, you're going 5 points out of this would be a decent return. Because I think, was it last year, definitely the first year, where South African teams were involved, you couldn't get a win over there, and then all of a sudden towards the end of last year teams started turning them over and getting wins. So I think it is becoming a bit more realistic. You're getting used to the travel, different conditions that you're playing and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's the reality is you're going to be going over there with expectations, and with the Sharks bottom of the table, Bulls top of the table, maybe splitting the difference and going with a 5 points out of 10. I think Connacht will take that, but they're going over with, I think JJ has brought so much into that team, as in a lot of experience. If anything happens to Jack Carty, or if they go full selection and go with JJ as well, or maybe both of them, I don't know how they'll do it. But Cahill Ford in there as well. You've got a lot of players. Like I think they've got such a good squad to be able to.
Joe Joyce has been an excellent addition as well. Like there's good depth. They've built some nice depth in there this year.
That's it. Like you might think of Connacht in different years and go, oh, going over to South Africa, they'll be beaten up. They shouldn't be beaten up at all. I think the belief within that group. I know, yeah, they've got 3 home games. Was that a reaction to the pitch being built the year before? I'm not sure if they were owed a couple.
It was, yeah. They had to kind of give up a home game last year.
So they had a run, I suppose, at the start of the year where, yeah, three wins on the trot probably doesn't always happen for Connacht. And I think I saw a stat that if they'd won the 4th game, it was the first time since 2002, was it? So that they won the first 4 games of the league. So I can tell you that they're in a really good spot. I know there's home games thrown in there, but I think within that group there's going to be a lot of belief, and they're going to be going over to South Africa with a huge amount of expectation. I don't think they're going over there thinking we'll have a crack at these 2 South African teams, and if we can get home with 2 losing bonus points, or 2 losing bonus points and 4 tries each, that wouldn't be actually the end of the world with 4 points coming away from there. But they'll want more than that. Definitely they'll want more than that and stay within the kind of top of that table. Because if you look at the Irish teams at the moment, they're within the top 7. If Munster lose at the weekend, all of a sudden they're dropping out. Connacht will be in a similar situation where they don't want a run of games pre-Europe, and all of a sudden they're under pressure, maybe 5 games on the trot, is it? And you're starting to get banged up and bruised, losing 1 or 2 players, and then you're facing into a really tough task of trying to get back into the top end of the table. So I think where they're at the moment, they'll be targeting these games to stay up there, because I think it's important for them as well. But they have the players and the squad to be able to do that.
Yeah, so that's Connacht Sharks is the first one up. That's live on RT2 and RT Player this Saturday afternoon. Last of the provinces, Leinster. I feel like we haven't actually been talking about them too much on the podcast in these early weeks, because they've been without so many players and have just been kind of going about the job without much of a fuss. I'd almost say it as a compliment. They've been involved in, aside from maybe the first game against Glasgow, which was a cracker, but a few uneventful games in a good way, where, there have been good things, there have been bad things, and they've got the bonus point win. Another one at the weekend, 30-10 winners against the Dragons in dreadful weather conditions. The pitch was cracking, but dreadful weather conditions, and it's always a game the Dragons away where it's get in, get your result, and get back out. There's a season isn't going to be defined on how much you beat the Dragons by away from home. But I will flip it to Jacques Nienaber coming in next week, because that's when things are going to get interesting. They're playing the Scarlets this weekend, but then they're into Munster ahead of the Champions Cup. Nienaber is coming in. The internationals are all going to be back, and all of a sudden it feels like Leinster's season is really, really starting now as we hit mid-November. What I want to know, Johnny, is we're all really excited about what Jacques Nienaber is going to do as a 2-time World Cup winning coach. I mean, for Leinster to be able to bring in a coach of that to work alongside / under Leo Cullen just speaks volumes for the draw they have. But in terms of what Nienaber is going to be doing this season, do you think it's going to be a case of minor tweaks and observe for a little while before fully putting his foot down and trying to implement ideas? Or do you see him coming in on day one and trying to say, okay, from now on, we're going to be doing X, Y, and Z?
No, I think you'll have to build on the structures, won't he? Like, I don't think you can come in and change things around too much, but I can guarantee you he'll have his work done when he gets in. Like, he's not going to be going, right, where's my office, where's my laptop? I can guarantee you he's got so many Leinster games on his laptop.
He hasn't been on holidays for the last 2 weeks, is what you're going to say?
Absolutely not. I don't know, does he do holidays? Like, he's no, I don't think if you're going to start in season, you better have your work done, or else you're not going to be able to have a handle on what you're doing when you come in. So if you don't have your work done, you're going to have to observe things until Christmas, like, aren't you? So like, you might as well be on gardening leave. So I think he's going to have a lot of work done, because as well, like, you're making first impressions with a lot of these people. Yeah, his reputation might precede him, but like, that's not good enough if you're going to continue to be a good coach. So like, he's going to want to come in and make an impression. But from my limited dealings with him, my guess is that he'll come in and have so much work done that he'll impress people with how much he's seen, how much detail he can go through, because that's what he's about anyway, isn't it? Like, that's what we know from the South Africa camp, that the details they go through are top levels. So like, he's going to come in and know everything about as many people as he can about their structures. And I think the sooner he can start implementing things, it will freshen things up. I was actually interested with Dan Sheehan's captaincy at the weekend. I just thought I was kind of watching back. I watched the first half of it. I thought it was fairly drab, and I went out to watch the second game here in Cork. But like, I was kind of thinking, and I had conversations at that game that I went to. They'll get their bonus point, they'll get out of there, it'll be 30 odd something, and it'll be, if you haven't watched that game, you'll think Leinster just doing Leinster things, but it was such a poor game in the first half with the weather conditions and everything else. You weren't really, well, you think they were going to get there, but I thought it was a genius move to give someone like Dan Sheehan, still young, but coming away from a disappointing World Cup, and giving him something to really drive it on with, a captaincy, something to prove a point with. And I think he did that. Obviously, he's got a highlight reel there of a turnover offload, running half the pitch to get back on the other end of a 1-2 with Kieran Frawley. So like, the energy he put into that game, maybe it's a genius stroke of making a guy like that captain and giving him something else to fight for, like,
Yeah, and based on the few internationals that have come back in for Leinster, the worry that there's going to be a big World Cup hangover, it's starting to subside a little bit. Players are looking pretty fresh, pretty determined, and pretty motivated.
Yeah, and I think if you're a Leinster player, like, you've got enough points to prove anyway. They've also been disappointed by their return in terms of silverware. So like, you're coming from one disappointment. You can't fix that World Cup disappointment too soon, unfortunately, but you can fix the Leinster one as a reaction. So I think they've just been reminded that they're coming back to a team that has a lot of hunger. And they've also, I think the thing about Leinster is they've got so much talent as well, and their squad is so competitive and capable that if they come back in and drag their heels, they won't be in the next Irish squad because the next guy will be in ahead of them, you know, and that's how you lose your Irish place as fast as anything. Come back into Leinster and don't perform because you've got the next Irish player potentially in your position, like, you know.
Particularly if you're a back row.
Yeah, particularly in the back row. So like I think they have to come in and perform, but I think no better environment to come back into with a coach that you've just seen work miracles, not miracles to be fair, but work a bit of magic in the World Cup. You're going to come back in and have a point to prove with a new coach, players that have got massive opportunities when you're away. So I think like, yeah, they're going about their business, but not the greatest game ever to watch if you go back and watch the Dragons one.
Yeah, and they're taking on the Scarlets this week. That's the late game on Saturday evening ahead of Leinster and Munster next week, which is going to be absolutely cracking at the Aviva Stadium. Johnny, before we go, coming up to the 1/3 mark of the AIL season with Cork Con, I'm going off results alone at the moment. Between the World Cup and stuff, I've seen very little AIL. I was watching a bit of Terranure and Lansdowne on Saturday afternoon after our own match down in Lakelands. But for yourselves, 4 wins from 5 games, second place in the table. 1 defeat was away to Ballynahinch, but you've beaten like a good Lansdowne team who started the season well. You went up to Lakelands and beat the defending champions and nilled them in their own back garden. A third of the way through the season, things going. You don't want to get carried away at this stage of the season, but things got moving along quite nicely.
Yeah, I think it's a good return. Like, unfortunately, the Ballynahinch game, we were behind for most of the game chasing it. We finally went ahead and we let them score in the last play. So, like, you know, for the 5 games, we have 4 wins that we're happy enough with and 1 that we're disappointed with because we could have ended up with 5 points that day, but we ended up with 2. You know, so it was definitely disappointing. We left some points on the road, but the league is so competitive. Like, if you're looking at Clontarf, obviously 5 from 5, we're 4 from 5. And then you've got a lot of teams that are kind of 3 from 5 and we're beating each other, you know. So it's funny you mentioned the AIL anytime Terranure get a big win and Dooley kicking a late winner. No, but I think like that now, Terranure inflicted Lansdowne second loss. So all of a sudden teams are beating each other. It's just someone needs to go and beat Clontarf to even things up a small bit. But it's been great. Like, I think there's the age in the league is coming down, definitely, you know, and you got a lot of young players that you need to instill a bit of belief in. And I think, you know, we're in a decent position now, but the AIL is funny because someone beats you at the beginning and all of a sudden you're thinking, geez, what's happened? Like, you know, everyone can beat everyone, you know, and, you know, we've Trinity this weekend. They haven't won yet, but they're going to get one. So you don't want to be, you don't want to tee yourself up for that either. Like, you know, and I don't know if Trinity ever been bottom of the league. Well, they might have been, but not in a long time. Not when I've been coaching there, so they're going to be massively dangerous. So it's just such an interesting league that it's so competitive week to week. There's obviously different player availability different week to week as well, but it's hugely competitive, and it's definitely a bit of a puzzle to solve from week to week too, you know.
Yeah, and what I do love about the structure of it is the way the fixtures snake. So that, you know, you come back, you play your first 9 games, but then you kind of double back. So the team you play in round 1 is the team you play in round 18, but the team you play in round 9 is the team you play in round 10. You have your 6th game this week, then it's a week break, and then you're back for another round of 3. What's left in that round of 3 as you head towards the snaking part of the season?
Yeah, we've Trinity around 6, and then we've a break, and we've got Clontarf, Cookies, and UCD in whatever order. I think Clontarf on the 2nd of December. So we've got, and then you reverse them like you said. So like you review a game, and it's nearly your preview for the next game because you reverse Christmas, and there's a lot of you know, it's all very fresh in your head. So it's very interesting part of reversing it backwards. But then the team that you played first, you don't see them again for the rest of it. You might come across some of their games when you're previewing, but it could be a completely different team by the time you see them again. Like the teams in the first 3 rounds, like obviously last year, Terranure beat us and whacked us up there 47-12.
And then you won what is it, with the second last game of the season?
Because it's the second last game of the season, you have so much time to nearly fix those things before you meet them again, and it's 2 completely different teams, like, you know. So it's definitely a very interesting league, but the structure makes it so as well. But it's tough work. Like 3 games on the trot. I know professional game, they're in there all day long, but like 3 with a week off, three blocks of 3 with a week off in between them, and then they're trying to squeeze cup games in and stuff as well around that. It's a tough enough schedule this side of Christmas. Obviously after Christmas you get a small bit different because it's 6 Nations weeks and you have to take weeks off and stuff like that, so it's not 3 threes, but before Christmas and 3-3s, it can be fairly daunting.
Yeah, well, best of luck this weekend. You've got Dublin University, and that brings you up to the 1/3 mark of the season. A reminder, Connacht away to the Sharks is live on RT2 and RT Player this Saturday afternoon. And we will be back here on the RTÉ Rugby podcast this time next week. Jonny, thanks a million.
Very much.